Right. Welcome, everyone, to the afternoon, day 2 of Dreamforce. Thank you for joining us here. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about platform limits within Salesforce. So we'll be looking at this in a sort of general context across the whole platform with some examples from Apex and the Enterprise API. And then afterwards, if we've got any questions, then we'll dive into that. My name is Kevin Rakowski. I'm a senior product manager with Salesforce. I'm focused on the Enterprise API specifically. Down in the audience here, we've got my colleague Abhinav, who's a lead software engineer, also on the Enterprise API. He'll be joining us during the Q&A session to answer some of your questions. I'm sure you've seen this a few times over the last couple of days already. This is our forward-looking statement. Some of the things that we're going to be discussing during this presentation have not yet been implemented. The features are subject to change, and the delivery date may slip and may disappear entirely. So please make all of your buying decisions based on currently released features and products. Okay, so today we're going to just quickly take a journey through limit. First of all, we're going to start by looking at the state of limits today. We'll then move into how we're evolving our limits to manage customer expectations, how we're reimagining our limits for the future, and what it is that we're going to do to get there. Now, the top line here really is that we recognize that limits can be somewhat confusing and frustrating for you as customers. We often come across situations where the limits that we have in place for your products and the API prevent you from undertaking business-critical operations. We are trying to understand how we can rethink those limits to ensure that we're not getting in your way when you need to do things, while still making sure that we are preserving the infrastructure and protecting the resources so that all of our customers are able to continue their business as normal. Okay, so what are the state of limits today within the Salesforce environment? Now, when Salesforce was a very, very young company, back in 1999, we had an extremely small number of customers. We had one product, we had a very limited number of locations where we had infrastructure, and the data needs of the customers that we had were also. We found ourselves in a very controllable situation in which we were able to actually look at resource utilization, understand which customers were utilizing the most resources, and handle that on a case-by-case basis. Now, as we grew and we took on more customers, expanded to more locations, added more feature sets, added more products, we needed to actually think about limits in a much more structured way. And so consequently, we had to start implementing some of the limits that we have in place today in order to make sure that all customers got fair access to resources without butting up against actual physical hard limits. We were also in a situation, however, where customer growth was potentially exceeding infrastructure growth. We would have more customers that we had to handle on the same amount of infrastructure, and so consequently we had to be a little conservative with some of the limits that we actually put in place. Now, as we look at Salesforce today, we have an extremely broad set of features and products. We have independent teams all developing features, not necessarily in conjunction with one another. So they all have to be able to set resource limits in a way that they don't butt up against each other. And again, consequently, we find ourselves sometimes being a little too conservative with the limits that we put in place to make sure that customers are able to all get fair access to the same infrastructure. So how do we think about limits at Salesforce? We generally bucket these into 3 different categories, and I want to take you through what those are. First of all, we think about guardrail limits. So a guardrail is really for us something that is part of the design. So for example, if you think about a package A, a package B, and a package C with differing amount of resources that you can get access to, that's a guardrail limit that we have in place. It's something that ensures that we are providing a fair allocation of resources to all of our customers. It's ensuring that you, as a customer, are not experiencing degraded performance due to someone else unfairly utilizing the system. And generally, these are things that can be raised. So if we look at some examples here, we can look at object limits, attachment sizes, number of formulas, the number of lookups that you have available to you. These are all things that generally we can scale up based on your package. The second type of limit that we think about are allocation limits. Now, allocation limits are generally incremental packages, things that we can actually, things that are related to your access to the system or to the degree to which you utilize the system. Now, generally with allocations, if we increase your individual allocation as a customer, it's not going to have a direct impact on another customer. Now, when we think about where we set these allocation limits, we have to look at the resources which are being used by a product or feature and understand how that would be how many customers we would actually be handling on that particular set of infrastructure and allocate it accordingly. Now, with allocation limits, these are typically things that we know because we can scale them independently of the resources, we will typically have some sort of fee associated with them to make sure that this is something that, as you're getting more use out of it, we are conversely also putting more money into the infrastructure to support it. So for example here, storage. The more storage you use, the more storage we have to buy. A fairly simple equation. API calls. Again, as we scale with customers, we want to be able to offer you more and more API calls, but it means that we have to build up infrastructure to be able to do that. Other examples include chatter limits or the number of sites that you might have when you're building some out using one of our products. And then lastly, the third categorization of limit that we think about are system protection limits. Now, these are much harder limits for us. So if we're exceeding system protection limits, then that means that we are actually bumping up against the constraints of the actual hardware itself. If we go above these system protection limits, then we know that there is going to be some type of degradation that occurs, and it's not going to impact just you as a customer, it's going to impact all of our customers. And so consequently, with these system protection limits, if we want to scale those up, we have to look at the underlying infrastructure. We either have to change the architecture, or we've just got to build out more of it. Now, Apex governor limits might not be something that you really think of as a system protection limit, but we have that limit in place to ensure that we are able to appropriately handle it. To expand that, we have to actually build out more infrastructure. Concurrency limits are also based on resource utilization. In order for us to increase our concurrency limits, we have to increase the underlying infrastructure. Pod health is something that we use as a measure of the number of resources which are being used within a particular data center or particular location. Similarly, CPU utilization, network utilization, fairly common system protection limits that we would look at. So with these three categorizations in mind, how is it that you as a customer today can actually understand what limits you are using for any of your particular products or features? Now, the first place that you would want to look would be our system overview page. This is a declarative way for administrators of an organization to be able to go in and find out information about your organizational limits. So here we can look at the schema, API usage, the business logic, UI, and licensing. And you can see that as we group those things, each of the limits that you have available to you, both the current utilization and the maximum amount of limits, are laid out in an easy to understand, straightforward way for admins. So this is a great way of getting a sort of 10,000-foot view of your limit utilization for you as an admin. Oh, there we go. Similar, sticking with the admin view here, you can look into the individual object limits that you have available to you. So each object within your org has a series of limits associated with it. This is also declarative, also through the Salesforce UI, allows you to understand current utilization, and importantly, these limits are per object. So these are not across every single object. You would dive into each individual object, and this will present you with information about your limits and utilization of those. Now, if we want to actually get a more detailed view of your limits utilization, we need to go down a level. So we implemented the limits resource, which allows you to poll the API and get back more detailed information about the maximum and remaining limits for your organization. This is something that you could use to programmatically get a snapshot of your resource utilization and determine whether or not you need to scale back your use of Salesforce resources. Now, it's important to note that calls to this limit do count against your API limit. Cursive, it's a little bit of an inception situation, but if you are polling the limits endpoint every couple of seconds, you will exhaust your limits endpoint. Just be careful. Use it sparingly. Get a snapshot of what's going on with your limits. Now, if you wanted, on the other hand, to get a more point-in-time understanding of limits, we also have a limit info header. So this is something that is present on the responses to the calls that you make to the API that will actually show you what your current utilization is for that limit and also what your maximum is. So you can see here in our REST example, the header is the Salesforce limit info header there, and it's telling you that right now you have a maximum of 5,000 on this particular endpoint, and you've used 25 so far. So this is something that does not count against your limits. This is something that's being returned back on every single response and provides you with a simple, straightforward way of understanding what resources you've utilized. And this is available in both REST and SOAP. The header is slightly different between them. It's Salesforce limit info in REST and limit info header in SOAP, but both of these do the same job. Let you know how much of the API resources you're utilizing. Okay, so that's a snapshot of where we are today. So how can we evolve our limits? What is it that Salesforce is doing now to try and improve the situation for you as customers, to make sure that limits are less of a concern for you in your integrations? Now, what we have heard from you is that our model is outdated. One of the biggest issues that occurs for you as a customer is that when you actually hit those limits, there is a hard stop. We're not offering throttling. We're not dialing back the rate at which you can access the resource. It's just like, okay, you've hit your limit. Sorry, come back tomorrow. That's not something that you as a customer want. And it really has a massive impact on your business processes. Now, even if we get to that point where you've hit your limits, it's difficult for us to actually increase the limits for you. You've got to talk to a customer support representative. They've got to talk to a product manager. The product manager has to say yes, and then they have to go back, and then they change it up. And the whole process takes a long time. Again, this is an absolutely suboptimal experience for you as a customer. And the third piece of feedback that we've received is that we really need to be able to handle bursting capabilities. On average, you may be well below your daily utilization, but you have a migration or a massive data import that you need to do. You want to schedule it over the weekend so that none of your end users are seeing the changes or are impacted by it. But to actually get that all done in a small period of time, you have to go over your limits, and we do not provide that bursting capability today. Oh, 1 second. So let's take a look at some examples of how we're evolving our limits to deal with this sort of feedback. Now, the first thing that we've done is started to just actually increase the limits. So This is very, very small baby steps here. For example, if we look at the number of Apex classes that we had per deployment, originally we started off with 500. Now, by the time we got to February of 2009, we'd increased that to 750. Okay, it's moderate, it's a step in the right direction. By the time we got to October of 2011, we went up to 5,000. So, okay, that's a big change, but it still wasn't enough. Where are we going to be by the time we get to the end of the month? Clearly, we need to have a better way of handling this. And those of you who are eagle-eyed observers, you might recognize this as something similar to Moore's law, or internally, as we might refer to it, Moore's law, as in you want more. So what are some of the other ways that we can actually evolve things and improve limits for you without massive architectural changes? Well, first of all, we've started to rethink limits to a certain degree. We start by removing limits. So we recognize the fact that there are some limits that just absolutely don't make any sense anymore. It's something that we might have implemented in the original versions of Salesforce. It might have been something that somebody set in 2001 and nobody ever bothered to go back and check and see if we still actually need it anymore. Again, sticking with Apex, we took a look at some of the limits that we had, and we identified, for example, the number of describe calls, the maximum size of the call-out request, the maximum number of concurrent call-outs. None of these actually made any sense for us anymore. So these are limits that we removed. Now, other types of limits we want to relax. As we were taking a look at in a couple of slides earlier, where we increased the number of limits, we can actually increase the amount of we can increase the limits that we provide to you, because the underlying infrastructure, the underlying architecture has grown, developed in a way that the original limits are just way too conservative. So some examples here, again sticking with Apex, of areas that we increased the limits. So for example, batch jobs in queued going from 5 to 100, a massive improvement for you as a customer. And then lastly, we look at where we can restructure our limits. So this is where we actually go back and we try to understand whether the things that we're measuring actually make sense anymore. Why is it that we're evaluating you against that? Does that make sense? Should we actually be looking at something else? Are we counting oranges when we should be counting apples? Where we find these sort of things, we restructure. And the example that we provide here is where we changed 24-hour asynchronous limits to number of synchronous calls. So rather than having a per 24-hour limit in there, which actually makes no sense, we're instead just looking at the total number of concurrent asynchronous calls there. So let's take a look at how these three different approaches layer together in the Apex limits. Now, on the left-hand side here, you can see the limits that we had in place before, and on the right, afterwards. So let's take a look at some of those examples that we just went through. So here's where we removed limits. Then here is where we relaxed limits. And then here are some of the areas that we restructured limits, where on the left were the limits that we were looking at before, on the right, the limit we're looking at after. Now, there's still not a direct one-for-one mapping here. There's a lot of other stuff that we were doing when we rethought the Apex limits. But you can see very easily how we've moved from a very large number of extremely limiting limits to a much more flexible, smaller number of limits that are measuring things that actually are important for the performance of your use of those features. Lastly, how are we going to go about reimagining limits? As we look to the future, how are we going to improve the situation for you? Now, the primary focus for us will be around the implementation of something that we're calling a soft limits framework. So this is a framework in which we can implement the ability for you as a customer to burst above your existing utilization. We want to be able to think about it in terms of the overall health of the system. If you're not hurting the health of the system by bursting above your limit, we should allow you to do that. It makes no sense for us to totally cut you off at 15,000 just because that's the number we had. If we're green and everything is good, we want to allow you to be able to do what you need to do. Now, we also need to provide mechanisms to track this over time. We need to be able to provide a way for you as a customer to understand your own utilization, to be able to understand over time what your limits usage looks like, and to understand whether you just want to dial it back because, let's say, you want to spread it out over a longer period of time, or if you actually need to increase your limits because you're consistently hitting or exceeding the limits that we have in place. And of course, lastly, we want to be able to build policies on top of this to allow overages. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be just the simple case of bursting above your existing limit. It's more being able to put in place policies that are dynamic and adjustable according to system utilization. So if we know that everything is green and we know that there's no issues in you going above your regular thresholds, we'll let you do it. If resource utilization is very high and we know that allowing you to burst would actually impact other customers, then we're not going to go above that set threshold limit. So the way that we'll actually enforce this in the future will change. Utilizing soft limits, we'll be able to focus on most of those transactional limits that we have today. So for example, concurrent transactions, CPU, database, etc. And instead of thinking about limits, we're going to think about thresholds. So thresholds are something that we set for you based on fair use and access to the system, but it's something that isn't absolute. It's something that we know you can go above, and it's a bar that we can set higher if we need to for your particular org. And we'll set these thresholds per organization, per entry point, and per limit type. So how are we going to approach this from the Salesforce side? Now, we want to be flexible and we want to be able to help you keep doing business. That's really the key thing here. But at the same time, we have to protect the resources that we're using to serve you, because we need to provide access to all customers. So in situations where there's infrequent breaching of your thresholds, we'll just let it go. It's fine. We recognize it. You have a cheat day. You want to go out there and burst above your limits. Fine. No problem. We'll get you back on the kale salad afterwards. Now, on the other hand, though, if we see that you're frequently going above the limits, then we're going to look at notifying you and asking if you would perhaps like to go up to a higher level. And if you don't, we'll probably look at throttling. Now again, this is still a very soft area here, so we know that we're not actually hurting anybody through you bursting above your threshold. But we would prefer for you to go to a higher tier so that we can plan accordingly and we can build out infrastructure as needed to support both you and all of the other customers. Now, if we see you continually doing this, if you're bursting above your threshold and you have said, no, I do not want to upgrade my limits at all, then we actually have to get to an enforcement point. That's where we would no longer allow you to burst above the threshold, and we would have to actually work with you to understand whether or not there are better ways of being able to handle those requests. And then lastly, when we're talking about the extreme case, we're talking about when we start hitting those system protection limits. When we know that you going up to X will actually hurt the system, or even worse, will hurt you. So let's take a quick look at what this might look like. Now here we've got calls against the REST API over the period of a typical month. Now, At this first point here, you can see that the customer has actually sort of burst above their existing threshold. So 15,000 is where the average threshold is going to be set today. In today's environment, if you hit that limit and you have not previously raised that limit, you will actually be cut off. In this new soft limits environment, we will allow you to burst above that, and as we said in the slide earlier on, we'll just let it slide. It's not a big deal. Everything's good, traffic is good, health is green, sure, go ahead. Now, later on in the middle of the month, this theoretical customer has not just burst above their threshold, they've gone to a point where we know that if we were to try and handle all of the traffic that they are throwing at us, it would impact other customers on the system. Pod health is still green, but we have to keep things within a specific container, within a specific set of limits to make sure that we are not going to adversely affect other customers. And so we've hit that here, but we've still gone relatively far above your regular threshold. Now, in this case, we would be looking to throttle at the top as opposed to outright just cut your traffic off. That we want to keep you operating as much as possible. And then finally, went back there. And then finally, in this last section, you can see that this customer has gone above their threshold. They're no longer at that point where we need to enforce them, but they are regularly above the set threshold. So this is the sort of environment where we will want to work with this customer to understand exactly what's going on with them and to potentially raise those limits up, to raise the threshold up so that we can plan accordingly for them and for other customers. Now let's take a look at that same example where the health of the pod that they're on is red. And again, pod may be terminology you haven't come across. Just think of it like a data center environment in which you're running. So basically, the place where your Salesforce instances are actually physically running. Now, if we are hitting this type of limit, it's red, it means that basically all of the resources are being heavily utilized. Things are still working perfectly fine for all of the customers, but we know that we can't put more customers on there without things actually starting to degrade. So this is the sort of point at which we would be building out new infrastructure or moving customers across new instances, because we know that in order to scale and grow and allow the customer to grow and to take on new customers, we will need to put them onto newer infrastructure. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a sort of red limit here. And in this same customer example, the customer can still burst at that first point of the month, but just not quite as much as they could before. In the previous example, they had gone just above that red line, but here they hit the red line and it's like, we're sorry, you can't go any further above this. Now wrong way here. In the second case, you can see that the customer hits those throttling limits far, far earlier than they did in the previous example. They get to that enforcement limit, and that's where they stay. And then in the last case, where they were just trending slightly above their standard threshold, you can see here that they're actually now starting to clip and hit into that enforcement threshold here. So this is how we see soft limits working within our environment. So we give you the flexibility to burst above your thresholds when possible, but we're also protecting the health of the resources that we're using to serve you. So hopefully it's a bit of a win-win situation for us. Now, how do we plan on getting there? In this release, internally, we have already implemented some basic threshold warnings. So we are at a point where we can understand how our resources are being used by customers like you and understand how many of you are frequently hitting these limits. In the next release, we want to be able to improve the analysis of this utilization. So we'll be putting in some slightly more granular ways of tracking this. And this is the same sort of granular analysis that we will want to be exposing out to you. So essentially, we're going to be trialing internally the systems that we want to make available to you. And we'll also be implementing our sort of basic policy application framework. So this will be the naive case where you hit your threshold and we let you burst above it by X%, for example. Then in summer 18, this is where we're looking at actually making the soft limits frameworks available to all of you. This is the point at which we'll have more granular policy enforcement and where we'll be able to expose the analytics data of this to you so that you can understand your limits utilization. Now, some further resources here for those of you that are interested to learn more about limits today. First of all, the URL that I've put up there, going to be pretty difficult for you to get from this distance, but Design Without Limits. That's one of our updated resources online to be able to explain limits within Salesforce today and tell you what the most important things are. Secondly, there's going to be a limits trailhead that we anticipate putting out there. So look for that in spring of 2018, and you can go through and you can get another badge. And then lastly, here at Dreamforce today, we have a limits cookbook that you will be able to find over at the Trailhead Zone. So this is going to be a nice little simplified cookbook that will explain limits to you and show you ways in which you can work within those limits and hopefully sort of not impact your own business. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Q&A. We have a microphone here in the middle. So if you have any questions, please walk up to that. And I'll be joined on stage by Abhinav. And between the two of us, we'll hopefully be able to answer any questions that you have.
We can ask.
We together? Do you want to go first?
We can do it together.
Okay.
You can start.
I'll start. You
and I'll
fill in the
kibitz.
blanks.
We're asking the same question.
Okay.
Yes.
So as an ISV, I'm making a managed package and putting it out there, and I'm very carefully watching my Apex CPU time. How am I going to be able to monitor that and figure out, am I working to a soft limit? Am I working to a hard limit? Is it a platform under load limit, or is that?
Okay, so I'll extend that because I'm also an ISV. And our challenge is that CPU limits will be hit, and the package or code that gets the blame for the limit is completely arbitrary. In the case of, say, it's exceeded in Process Builder, whatever code is hit next gets the blame. And we have no way of knowing which code, processes, formulas, validation rules, and so on are actually using CPU time in a given execution context, which means that our customers are blaming random people. We have no way of knowing what's actually going on. And we can't use debug logs because by definition, if we're burning CPU limits, we've exceeded all possible debug log capturing.
Right.
Help!
Help, okay. So, I don't have a straightforward answer that is going to answer all of those problems. But what I can say is that I welcome that feedback, and that's something that we'll definitely look at as we're creating these soft limits. And particularly, ISVs are very important to us at Salesforce. I mean, you are helping us grow our customer base so much. And so we will absolutely be looking at these sort of concerns as we build out soft limits over the next couple of releases.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nice job.
Hi. So it seems like the move to soft limits really is just a better notification structure on what we have now. That when we hit 70%, you will, in some cases, would get a notification, and if it happens a lot, you'd get a different notification. So, do you see this really coupled with an overall significant increase in limits, which would actually have more of an impact on what I can and can't accomplish?
So I think the way that I would look at it is not as a better notification system. What we're striving for is, first of all, to be able to set a sensible threshold. You know, what your limits are today is what will become a threshold in the future. So, with the API, for example, 15,000 calls per day limit, versus 15,000 calls per day threshold. Difference is you hit 15,000 calls today, you don't get any more calls. 15,000 calls in soft limits, we're going to let you go above that, and we understand you're going to go underneath it again. But that threshold is kind of what we're using to plan our resource allocation. Does that make sense? So in other words, it's like we are trying to strive to handle all of the customers on the resources that we have, to build out resources when we need to. And if we can handle your traffic, we want to. We want to allow you to burst above it so that you are not being impacted. Your business continues. I think that's more the way that I would look at it. Does that make sense? Or
It does, but it's still, honestly, it sounds a little more like spin. Because at 12,000 today, I'm watching my limits, and so I'm sort of self-notifying, hey, we're bursting above our usual, and at 15,000, we're going to hit that maximum stop cold block. So we're doing that internally now with a lot of mechanisms to monitor that. So really, like, it's only really going to matter that, well, we'll get better notifications without having to do elaborate tracking ourselves, which is great. But if the overall limits increase, that's what actually would help us to build better, bigger, more complex systems.
Right, and so that latter point, as we're going through this, when we get to those thresholds, as I showed earlier on in the deck, we will evaluate. Does 15,000 still make sense? Can we go to 20,000 safely? Where we can raise those limits, we will raise those limits. But the key difference is that rather than being absolute, we recognize that you can go above it if everything is fine and good. In the example where I showed like the green versus red, if everything's dandy, if we've got the resources to take on the additional traffic, sure, we'll do it. But if we know that we're running really hot, then that's where we'll actually start capping things off. So don't think of this as necessarily like just a way of raising the limits and sort of, you're going to go up to the maximum every single time. It's more that we're trying to trade off sensible limits for you with our resource utilization. Just try to sort of make it a little bit more nuanced so that we can take additional traffic where possible, where we can ensure you're continuing, your business transactions are continuing without getting impacted, but we're still making sure that you are not going to hit a point where some other customer gets totally impacted as a result.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Back to everyone's favorite CPU governor limit. Currently, this limit is shared between customizations, Apex customizations, and managed packages, which holds us, your customers, accountable for code quality of the products that we have no control whatsoever. Are you thinking about decoupling those limits and giving us our own portion of CPU, which we can reliably count on to keep it working?
I do not have. Do you have any insights into that? Probably not.
No, not.
Yeah, it's working.
No, not right now. But that's something that we should look into. We have certain things in play for ISVs getting their own set of limits. Unfortunately, CPU is not in that right now, but we can look to add that as well. The way we're thinking is ISV should have their own set of limits, and org should have their own set of limits. So when your package gets deployed, it shouldn't use the org shared limits. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess to a certain extent. It would be.
Have we hit our limit then?
2 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.